Hello, today we will be talking about the poem Widow by Sylvia Plath. This is a confessional poetry in the poetry genre, and it was published around the 1950s. The contents that we will be going over, I will be reading aloud this poem while I go over the theme, tone, rhythm, structure, and form, agreement, literary devices, syntax, and there will be a conclusion. Sylvia Plath was born in Jamaica Plain, Boston, and she is mostly known for her confessional-focused poetry. She was mostly influenced by Virginia Woolf, Emily Bront, and Saxton. Sadly, Sylvia Plath died at an early age of 30 in suicide in 1963. She did write several children's books beforehand and a total of 455 poems before she took her life, which were published a little bit after she had died. Throughout this poem, Widow by Sylvia Plath, we will read about the grief and pain-like feelings grief can cause when you lose someone. This poem has a theme of emotional isolation, intense grief, new identity, and sorrow. This poem also talks about the spiritual disconnection and the emotional estate that can consume a person and leave them detached and lifeless from others and the world. The poem starts off like this. Widow, the word consumes itself. Body, a sheet of newsprint on the fire, levitating a numb minute in the updraft over the scalding red topography that will put her heart out like an only eye. This first section of the poem is talking about Sylvia, the poet, being consumed by the idea of becoming a widow. The word itself is painful to say out loud, or even write. This is why Plath writes that this loss gave her such a deep pain that she felt like her body could be burned, just like a piece of newspaper easily destroyed. Plath then talks in the poem that this heartbreak feels like it has taken away her ability to see anything clearly. Plath describes her loss as a pain that has become numb. The next lines of the poem, Widow, the dead syllable with its shadow of an echo exposes the panel in the wall, behind which the secret passages lies, stale air, fusty remembrance, the coiled spring stair that opens at the top onto nothing at all. In this part of the poem, the word widow becomes a word that has no meaning. She then talks about secret passages that are symbolism in the poem. She tries to think about old memories and emotions, but when she does, it leads to nothing but grief and sadness. The metaphor of the coiled spring stairs show that no matter what she does, she's still not going to be able to move on. She still feels at this point that there is no way out. This poem has a free-flowing pace. It has 8 stanzas and no pattern. The poem uses a lot of repetition to show the heavy sense of loss. The most common repetition in this poem is the word widow. This is syntax, which is used throughout the poem. An example of this is the line that will put her out like an only eye. Widow, the bitter spider sits in the center of her loveless spokes. Death is the dress she wears, her hat and collar, The moth face of her husband, moon white and ill, circles her like a prey she'd love to kill. A second time, to have him in again, a paper image to lay against her heart, the way she laid his letters till they grew warm and seemed to give her warmth like a live skin. But it is she who is paper now, warmed by no one. Sylvia talks about a spider. This is to show how she feels like a spider who is stuck in a web with nowhere else to go, and if she falls from the web, there will be nothing but loose air and dry dirt that could kill her. All that she could think about is death. She describes that she's wearing death as a dress and that she feels haunted by her husband. She describes her husband with words moth face in the poem. She describes wanting him back to the point of killing to have him back. She wishes she could have even a picture or a remembrance of his face in her brain. She thinks about his letters she used to read and craves that warmness he once gave her. But now this is gone. She is nothing but the paper he used to write the letters to her with. She feels flat and easily crumbled up. She says this to emphasize the emptiness she feels about her husband had died. The poem continues. Widow, that great vacant estate, the voice of God is full of draftiness, promising simply that hard stares, the space of immortal blankness between stars and no bodies, singing like arrows up to heaven. She sees herself like an empty building with strong walls, but empty inside. She then brings up hearing the voice of God, but even his voice seems far away, could not comfort the spaces between all the walls. This line in the poem is personification. This part in the poem shifts from longing to despair, the immortal blankness and hard stars in case that she has no hope left. She believes that even the thought of going to heaven and reuniting with her husband seems bleak, because even that is empty with no bodies or souls. This poem has a mixture of different tones that includes sadness, numbness, emptiness, and ghostliness. This poem's tone jumps from the following back and forth. We can see this in the many enjambments in the poem, each feeling a tone bleeding into the other lines, like a broken pen with ink getting all over. An example of this is these two enjambments. The bitter spider sits in the center of her loveless spokes. A second time to have him in again, a paper image to lay against her heart. Widow. The compassionate trees blend in, the trees of loneliness, the trees of mourning. They stand like shadows above the green landscape, or even like a black holes cut out of it. A widow resembles them, a shadow thing, hand-folding, hand and nothing in between. A bodiless soul could pass another soul in this clear air and never notice it. One soul passed through the other, frail as smoke and utterly ignorant of the way it took. Sylvia talks about the compassionate trees that she feels are grieving with her. She describes these trees as blending in, trees of mourning. This describes and shows her isolation that she has using through and giving lifelike features to the trees using personification. She does this because there is no one else around her but in lifelike objects and nature things and natural things. We can see this when she says that the trees are shadows and black holes. This emphasizes the lack of life around her and the emptiness she feels. She compares these trees to a shadow thing with no substance. This shadow thing is herself. She is describing herself as a person who is just existing but not living. She feels like no part of her will be able to connect with others again after the grief she has felt from this loss. Sylvia isolated herself to the point where she felt like a person walked by her and they didn't notice her from how unlike an emptiness she was feeling and gave off. She felt like she was smoke and people could walk right through her. This is the fear she has, the fear his soul may beat and be beating at all her dull sense, like blue Mary's angel, dove-like against a pane, blinded to all but the gray, spiritless room. It looks on and must go on looking it on. At the end of the poem, she shares her deepest fear with the reader. Her deepest fear is that she believes her husband's soul still might be trying to contact her. She is afraid that she won't be able to sense when he does. The poem refers to Mary, the angel of Christian tradition. Sylvia feels so empty that she believes, because of all her sadness and emptiness, she will be unable to feel anything beyond that, even her husband's soul contacting her. The last line of the poem indicates that the angel is trying to look in on her, but then the angel must go on looking in on. This last line conveys the widow's fear again, that she is so lost within her own grief and her numbness and pain she believes, because of her grief, she won't be able to experience her husband's soul that's trying to connect with her. This poem uses different line lengths and pacing. Sometimes the line lengths are long and sometimes they are short. This shows that a certain things make Sylvia feel more overwhelmed than others. The areas of the poem that have a longer length show the slow tone verses. The shorter stanzas in the poem create a more abrupt read. This poem uses a lot of literacy elements. The ones I found intriguing the most in the poem were the imagery, metaphor, and personification of the poem. And these are some of the examples that I found while reading the poem. The trees of loneliness, the trees of mourning imagery, death is the dress she wears, her head and collar metaphor. The voice of God is full of draftiness, personification. In conclusion, the poem Widow by Sylvia Plath is a poem about loss and grief. This poem can help others get through their own grief when they're experiencing losing a loved one. This poem can help others understand that what they are feeling is common. What they are feeling is an emptiness and grief that others feel as well when they are losing a loved one or person that they love. This poem can help others understand their feelings and know that it is okay to feel these feelings. This presentation gave a better understanding of the poem Widow by Sylvia Plath. I encourage you to seek other poems by Sylvia Plath if you liked this one. Thank you for your time.